There are moments in a man's life when the very thing he built his world upon begins to crack beneath his feet. Not because he stopped believing, but because life happened, and life does not always ask permission before it breaks you. This is the story of two men, one young, one old, and the God who is silent when both of them needed him most. It was a late afternoon in the city, the kind of afternoon where the sun hangs low and golden and the world slows down whether you want it to or not. An elderly man named Elias sat alone on a park bench. He had been a pastor for over 40 years. He had buried church members, counseled broken marriages, and preached through seasons he himself did not understand. He was 67 now, retired, and still every afternoon he came to this bench, with his Bible, with his bread, with his silence. A young man named Daniel arrived. He did not greet Elias. He simply sat down beside him heavily, the way a man sits when he is carrying something he no longer has the strength to hold. Daniel was 28 years old, a worship leader, a seminary student. 3 weeks ago, his sister Joy had died of cancer. He had prayed. The whole church had prayed. God had not answered the way they asked. And now Daniel was here, on this bench, running out of words. After a long silence, Daniel spoke first, staring straight ahead, not even looking at the older man beside him. Daniel said, "You know what I keep thinking about?" Elias did not turn immediately. He finished tossing a piece of bread to the pigeons at his feet. Then, quietly, Elias said, "Tell me." Daniel exhaled slowly and began to speak. Daniel said, "The day I got baptized, I was 19. I came out of that water and I was so sure, completely, absolutely sure that God was real, that he saw me, that he would never let me go." Elias nodded gently. Elias said, "I remember that day. You cried the whole drive home." Daniel went quiet for a moment. Then, in a voice just above a whisper, Daniel said, "I can't find that feeling anymore, Elias." Elias turned to look at him. Elias said, "What feeling?" Daniel said, "That he's there. Any of it. I lead worship on Sundays and I'm standing at that microphone and I'm singing, 'You are faithful, God, you are faithful.' And inside I'm thinking, 'Are you? Are you really?'" Elias studied his face carefully. Then Elias said, "How long have you been carrying this?" Daniel said, "Since the funeral, maybe before. I don't know." Elias said gently, "You haven't sinned by doubting, Daniel." Something snapped in Daniel then. He turned sharply and said, "Don't give me a sermon right now, please. I'm not one of your congregation. I'm asking you as a man, did you ever stop believing? Truly stop? Because right now it doesn't feel like doubt. It feels like absence, like I've been talking to an empty room for 3 weeks." There was a long silence. Elias did not rush to answer. He never did. It was one of the things that made him different from most people who called themselves wise. Then, simply and quietly, Elias said, "Yes." Daniel looked up. He had not expected that word from this man. Elias continued. Elias said, 1987. My son Marcus was 6 months old. My wife had a stroke. She survived, but she couldn't speak for 2 years. 2 years, Daniel. I was a pastor. I had a congregation. Every Sunday I preached the goodness of God while driving home to a wife who couldn't say my name, while feeding a baby who would never hear his mother sing to him. Daniel stared at him and said, "I never knew that." Elias said quietly, "Nobody did. That's the loneliness of leadership." Daniel asked, "What did you do?" Elias said slowly, "I stopped pretending I was okay, and I started being angry, honestly, furiously angry, at God." Daniel looked at him with wide eyes and said, "You?" Elias said, "Read your Psalms, son. David wasn't polished when he was hurting. My God, why have you forsaken me?" That's not a man in control. That's a man at the edge. And God didn't strike him down for it. He preserved those words, put them in scripture, made them holy. Elias stood, walked a few steps away and tossed more bread to the pigeons at his feet. His voice was quieter now, almost as if he were speaking to himself as much as to Daniel. Elias said, "Silence isn't the same as absence. I've had to learn that more times than I'd like." Daniel, still bitter, said, "That sounds like something you say when you have no better answer." Elias turned around and looked at Daniel directly, steady, unshaken. Elias said, "Maybe, but I'm still here, and so are you." The afternoon light faded slowly around them, and for a long moment neither man said anything at all. That evening, Daniel sat at Elias's kitchen table. The kitchen was modest and a little worn, the kind of kitchen that had fed many people over many years and never once complained about it. Elias made tea while Daniel sat staring at a photo on his phone, his sister, Joy. She was smiling in the photo the way she always smiled, like she knew something the rest of the world hadn't figured out yet. Daniel had not touched the food in front of him. Elias brought 2 mugs of tea to the table and sat across from Daniel. Daniel placed his phone face down on the table and spoke. Daniel said, "Her name was Joy. You know why my parents named her that? She was premature, 26 weeks. Doctors said she had a 5% chance. She survived. They named her Joy because they said God gave her to them like a gift." He paused. Then Daniel said, "What kind of God gives a gift and then takes it back after 24 years? Elias said, "The same God who gave his own son." Daniel looked up sharply and said, "Don't compare that to this." Elias said, "I'm not making it equal. I'm saying loss is woven into the very nature of how God operates in this world. It doesn't make it painless, it doesn't make it clean, but it means he is not a stranger to grief." Daniel leant forward and said, "We prayed, Elias, the whole church, 40 days. We fasted, we believed. Pastor Emmanuel anointed her with oil. She still died. What was the point of any of it?" Elias picked up his Bible from the table and held it without opening it. Then Elias said, "Can I tell you something hard?" Daniel said flatly, "Everything you say is hard." Elias said, "Prayer is not a transaction. It is not a formula where if you perform the correct steps, God is obligated to give you the outcome you want. That is not faith. That is vending machine theology." "So what is it then? What's the point of asking him for anything?" Elias said, "Because asking keeps you in relationship, because the asking itself changes you, whether or not the answer is yes, because sometimes God's answer is not what we want, but it is what he, in his infinite sight, has determined is right. And sometimes we are standing too close to the painting to see what he is making." Daniel's voice broke then. Daniel said, "She was 24 years old, Elias. She had a whole life." Elias said quietly, "I know." Daniel said, "She trusted God more than anyone I've ever known. She never doubted, not once. She was better than me in every way, and she died, and I'm still here, asking questions and falling apart. Tell me how that's fair." Elias said, "It isn't, not by any human measurement of justice." Silence settled over the kitchen. The tea grew cold. Then Elias said slowly, "But fairness was never God's highest value. Love is, and love sometimes costs everything." Daniel put his face in his hands. Elias did not rush to comfort him. He let him feel it, all of it. Then, slowly, he rose from his chair, walked around the table and placed one hand on Daniel's shoulder. He said nothing, because sometimes after everything has been said, the only thing left is presence, and presence in that moment was enough. They went to the cemetery the next day. Midday, bright light, the kind of light that makes everything look clear yet explains nothing. Joy's headstone was simple, her name carved plainly into the stone. Daniel had brought fresh white lilies and placed them at the base. He stood with his hands in his pockets. Elias stood a few steps behind him, giving him the space that only a man who has stood at graves himself knows how to give. Daniel crouched slowly and touched the headstone with one hand. He spoke quietly, as if Joy might still hear him. Daniel said, "I haven't been able to play the piano since you died. Not once. Every time I sit down, I hear you singing. You always sang off-key and never cared. You'd just close your eyes and sing like you were the only one in the room with God." He stood. He turned to face Elias. Daniel said, "Is it possible I was believing in the wrong thing this whole time? Not God, but a version of God I constructed, one who would always answer yes, one who would protect the people I love if I was good enough." Elias stepped forward slowly. Elias said, "Now that is the most honest thing you've said since this began." Daniel almost laughed. He didn't expect to, but he did. Elias said, "Every person of faith, if they live long enough and love deeply enough, comes to that reckoning. The God of comfortable theology meets the God of reality, and the collision is violent." Daniel said, "So what do you do with it?" Elias said, "You let the false version die, and you keep walking towards the real one. Even when you can't feel him, even when your legs won't move, you drag yourself forward, because he is not less real because you cannot feel him today.